This committee hearing will come to order. I'll ask all the members if you can take your seats at this time. And for the members of this committee, for many, many years, one of our key concerns has been North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And last year, as we'll recall, we saw 2 tests of an atomic weapon in North Korea, along with 20 separate tests of their intercontinental ballistic missile system, including, and I think this is concerning to all of us, including a test in which a submarine fired an ICBM. And right now, the effort in North Korea is to miniaturize the size of their atomic weapon so as to put it on the head of that missile. And that's what's got our attention. At this point, it's clear that very, very soon North Korea is going to be able to target all 50 states in the United States, as well as target our allies. And at the same time, it's the rapid speed of this advance, and the fact also that North Korea has this history of proliferating. You know, they get their ICBM technology, or they get their ability to create a nuclear bomb, and they sell that. And this is another concern that we have, because this is really a game changer to our national security. And when you think about the history of this, and I will remind the members here, we do have a strategy that in the past has worked, and I think the members might all concur on this. In South Africa, our strategy of implementing sanctions actually worked. With respect to the Banco Delta Asia, the strategy of implementing sanctions on North Korea did halt their ability for a while to develop their missile program. And so you find a strategy that does work, and you try to implement it. My concern is, since the '94 Framework Agreement, since that Clinton administration agreement, and then during the Bush years, when, again, the administration was talked out of deploying the sanctions which Treasury had put on North Korea, which was causing real pain in North Korea. Kim Jong-il was not able to pay his generals. That was lifted. Then we go to the Obama administration, and for 8 years we've had what is called strategic patience. These strategies have not worked. One of the steps we took in this committee was to pass legislation authored by myself and Mr. Engel, which would deploy a strategy which I think will work, and that is the types of sanctions that really cut off all of the hard currency. And the situation was desperate enough that the National Security Council also took up this approach at the United Nations and passed a similar provision. The question is, at this point, will we implement it, and will we implement it in time to really cut off that access to the one asset North Korea needs in order to build out its weapons program and advance it? And that's one of the reasons for this hearing. With that law, what we did was to designate North Korea as a primary money laundering concern. And we found the head of that regime, Kim Jong-un, responsible for, as the Economist summed up our messaging here, running a gulag masquerading as a country. So with that push, our question now is, what else can we do to crack down on that regime? We have $2 billion that regime is using from indentured servitude, in which North Korean workers are sent abroad and the money comes in to the government rather than being paid to the worker. That's one area where the international community and where the United States can put additional pressure. We could target that expat labor. There are loopholes in the North Korean shipping and financial sectors with respect to the implementation of some of these agreements. That should be closed. And when we discover that foreign banks have helped Kim Jong-un skirt sanctions as those in China have recently done, we've got to give those banks a stark choice. And this was what was done by Treasury back during the Banco Delta Asia period, where they were told you're either going to do business with the United States or you're going to do it with North Korea, but not both. And those 10 banks froze the North Korean accounts. We also obviously should step up our defenses of the homeland here and should have a more concerted information push about North Korea internationally to build support. But one of the things I'll call the attention of the members of the committee to is that Tae Young-ho, the former deputy ambassador from North Korea to Britain, and that's the highest ranking defector we've talked to since the Minister of Propaganda defected. And we had an opportunity, we were the first, I think, in the West to have an opportunity to talk to him in Seoul at the time. He had defected through China. He said last month that international sanctions are really squeezing the regime. And he said the spread of information from the outside world is having a real and negative impact on that regime. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that South Korea has reported a very high level of defections, that they are surging. And we won't be able to tackle the North Korean threat on our own. So I'm glad that the Secretary of Defense made his first trip overseas to visit our allies in South Korea and visit our allies in Japan and beyond. And General Mattis called the U.S.-South Korea alliance the linchpin of peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region and made clear the administration's commitment to deploy a U.S. missile system known as THAAD. And General Mattis's trip to the region, I think, was an important reminder that our ironclad relationship continues through political transitions, both here and at home in South Korea. So, our panel this morning has important insights on Kim Jong-un's goals, on vulnerabilities that we can exploit, and on how the President can better use the authorities that Congress has given him through the legislation that we passed here in the committee. And I now turn to the ranking member for his opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing to look into one of the most complicated and dangerous national security issues we're facing. The Kim regime's nuclear, missile, and offensive cyber capabilities are a problem for us and for our friends and allies in the Asia-Pacific. I would say they're a problem to everybody. To our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. We're grateful for your time and your expertise on this matter. Because I've been to North Korea twice, people think I'm an expert on Korea, but actually I'm not. I have been there twice, one time with my friend Joe Wilson. I don't know if Joe is here yet, but Joe said to me that he and I are the only two members of Congress currently who have visited North Korea. I can tell you we only were in Pyongyang, but it's unlike lots of things we've seen before. Unlike. Last year, North Korea conducted an unprecedented number of illegal nuclear and conventional weapons tests. These tests were met with strong rebukes by the UN Security Council, and the Obama administration played a pivotal role working with China to close a loophole in existing sanctions related to coal, and we're watching closely to see if China is keeping its word about limiting coal imports from North Korea. But with each test, the North Koreans learn more and more about how to perfect their illegal weapons, and with each test, our allies in Seoul and Tokyo are reminded of just how dangerous their neighborhood has become. After all, they're sitting in the direct path of a North Korean conventional or nuclear attack every day. That's why the South Korean government is moving ahead with the deployment of the THAAD anti-ballistic missile, a purely defensive system despite protests from Beijing. And we should be clear, this threat is not limited to Northeast Asia. The best minds working on this problem agree that North Korea is just a few years or even less from a weapon that could reach the United States. So we're left with a critically short period of time to stop that from happening. The President recently tweeted that it never will. Well, I hope for our sake he's asking the questions and shaping the policies that would forestall such a development. I must say, however, I worry about some of the new President's other comments that touch on this issue, that more countries should have access to nuclear weapons, that we should increase our own nuclear arsenal, that we should wage a trade war with China, whose cooperation is essential in dealing with North Korea, And of course, when we're talking about a regime with a human rights record as terrible as North Korea's, slamming our door on refugees is in a sense turning away from the plight of the North Korean people are enduring. So I hope today we can have a good conversation about that right approach to these policies and the best way to see them put in place. Now, in my view, our approach needs to factor in just how volatile the Kim regime can be. At the same time, we have little visibility into their military capabilities and decision-making apparatus. So we need to come at this challenge with a combination of shrewd diplomacy, tough economic sanctions, defensive military measures, and cool-headed calculation, this sort of wraparound approach that gets all our international partners involved. This is not a problem we can solve on our own. We need our allies. So keeping our promises to them matter for their security and for the security of the U.S. service members deployed in Northeast Asia. I'm glad that Secretary Mattis's first trip was to Asia, and I trust that his meetings provided a sense of reassurance to our friends, and I'm sure we'll be able to ask him questions, hopefully when he comes before the committee. We also need to keep China from working at cross purposes with us in this effort. China is the linchpin for sanctions enforcement against the Kim regime, so it would be foolish to alienate Beijing either through a reckless trade policy or by sweeping second and third order sanctions that crack down on Chinese entities but cost us Beijing support. So we have to keep a lot of balls in the air, pressure the regime, keep China on board with existing sanctions, while stepping up enforcement, reassure our allies, get the Kim regime back to the table. Obviously, it's complex stuff. Foreign policy usually is, and we've struggled across Republican and Democratic administrations to find the right balance, but I'm convinced that American leadership can and will make the difference. We cannot back away from this responsibility because the cost of failure in this case is just too great. So I'm interested in hearing our witnesses' views on getting to a reasonable policy toward North Korea. Our chairman has been especially interested in this region and has done a lot of good work in the region. I know many of his constituents are interested in it as well, but we all should be interested because it is such an important region for us and for the world. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel and I have been in North Korea. It's a very depressing place. I spent a couple of days there, but up until very recently, when we've had this now many more defectors in the last year or so, it was very hard to access information. We're joined by a distinguished panel today, which can give us all much greater insight about North Korea. And if I could introduce them, Dr. Victor Cha is Senior Advisor and Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, he served as the Director for Asian Affairs on the National Security Council. We have Dr. Sue Mi Terry, Managing Director for Korea at Bauer Group Asia, and previously Dr. Terry served in a series of positions focusing on Asia at the National Intelligence Council, the National Security Council, and at the Central Intelligence Agency. We have Mr. Anthony Rogero, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he served previously in the Treasury Department as Director of the Office of Global Affairs, where he developed and implemented policy to combat all forms of illicit finance. And lastly, we have Ambassador Bob Gallucci, Distinguished Professor at Georgetown University, previously served in multiple senior positions at the State Department, where he focused on nonproliferation. Ambassador Gallucci was the chief U.S. negotiator during the North Korean nuclear crisis of 1994. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record, and members will have 5 calendar days to submit statements or questions or any extraneous material for the record. And we'll start with Dr. Cha. If you could please summarize your remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee. It's a distinct honor to appear before you to discuss the challenges posed by North Korea. Mr. Chairman, presidencies are defined not by the agenda they have coming into office. Instead, the mettle of every presidency is tested by the unexpected crises that come their way, and in particular, how they respond to those crises. For President Bush, for example, this crisis was clearly 9/11. For President Trump, the crisis could very well come from North Korea. Over the past 8 years, the regime in Pyongyang has demonstrated 3 tendencies. It has spurned any serious and substantive diplomacy with its neighbors. It has pressed forward aggressively with the military testing program of ballistic missiles and nuclear devices, and it has continued to perpetrate human rights abuses of the worst kind around, in the country. It is highly likely that the North will carry out another ICBM test or nuclear test early in the Trump administration. The purpose would be to demonstrate advancements in their technology and to assert a position of strength that would put the president back on his heels. Any new strategy towards North Korea must be based on a full reading of the negotiating record of past administrations. As veterans of past negotiations from both Democratic and Republican administrations, Bob Gallucci and I have laid out the general principles that should undergird any policy review in a report for the Bush Institute last November, which we have submitted for the record. In addition to those principles, I believe that a new policy must be based on certain assumptions, all of which represent changes from the past. First, North Korea under the current regime will not give up its nuclear weapons. Second, the portfolio of pressure and diplomacy administered over the past 25 years has been ineffective. Third, the DPRK program is a significant threat. It is no longer a small program. The uranium-based program has the potential for a nuclear breakout, producing scores of weapons on an annual basis. Fourth, absent a change in its strategic thinking, China will limit its cooperation to those measures that do not risk a collapse of the North Korean regime. Fifth, the threat currently faced in the theater by North Korea's nuclear progress will enlarge to a homeland security threat in the course of the current administration's tenure. The situation requires that we seek a new policy that revisits some of the core tenets of U.S. policy as practiced by previous administrations. The first new tenet has to do with the question of risk. A new policy towards North Korea must entail a higher level of risk acceptance on the part of the United States. In general, we seek to minimize risk as we deal with North Korea policy, but this minimization has had two effects. First, it has restricted the options available to us, and second, it has allowed the DPRK to incrementally but significantly grow their program. We have to be willing to accept more risk, both in military strategy and in diplomacy. Second, with regard to defense and deterrence, the United States and the ROK have no choice but to expedite the deployment of THAAD on the peninsula. In addition, North Korea's claims that they are now able to mate a nuclear warhead with a long-range ballistic missile compels the United States to think about its declaratory policy. Absent very good intelligence, which is rare with North Korea, we will not know what is atop the next Unha rocket that they put on a launch pad. Third, with regard to sanctions, we need to keep the pressure on and expand the scope of sanctions. We've had, as the chairman said, the Section 311 sanction, the coal sanctions, but sanctioning of North Korea's slave labor exports and third-party entities that have willful involvement in DPRK insurance fraud schemes should be considered as well. With regard to China, China is both part of the problem and part of the solution. We need Beijing's cooperation, particularly on sanctions. But as we talk about in our report, we should not subcontract our policy to our peer competitor in the region. Secondary sanctioning against Chinese entities that knowingly or unknowingly facilitate North Korea's WMD proliferation activities and other illicit activities is a must. Regarding Russia, Russia has traditionally been a bit player on the Korean Peninsula and in the six-party talks, but there may be more opportunities for a larger Russian role. Aside from cooperation on nuclear counterproliferation, a UN Security Council strategy that sought Russian acquiescence to new resolutions, for example on human rights, could increase pressure on both the DPRK and China. Finally, on diplomacy, we should remember that no U.S. policy should be composed only of sanctions, military exercises, and diplomatic isolation. Historians would remember such a policy as paving a path to war. As I noted, a new U.S. policy must entail greater risk, and this applies not just to coercive measures, but also to diplomacy. I'm not in a position today to map out those new diplomatic overtures to the regime, but these will be incumbent upon the new administration to contend with as they map out a path in dealing with the most vexing security challenge in Asia today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cha. Ms. Terry. Dr. Terry?
Yes, thank you. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today. This year, North Korea is sure to continue with its dangerous provocations, including hostile missile and nuclear tests. According to Tae Young-oh, high-ranking North Korean official who defected to Seoul last year, Kim Jong-un is determined to complete development of his nuclear weapons program by the end of this year, 2017. Mr. Tae's statements confirm what we've known all along, that Kim has staked his legitimacy on perfecting the nuclear arsenal that his father and grandfather have pursued at the cost of billions of dollars and millions of lives. And he's unlikely to give it up for any price. In terms of timing, I think he may choose to wait a little bit to buy time because he may want to calculate, or he may calculate that it is better to show some restraint to explore, to see if there's a pathway to talks with the Trump administration. While Kim has no intention of giving up his nuclear program, he still seeks dialogue with Washington to shore up both his internal standing and to secure international recognition of the North as a nuclear weapons state. In response to this North Korean threat, there is a number of respected Korea watchers, some of our dearest colleagues, who argue that sanctions strategy has failed and that it is time to return to negotiations, even without precondition. They point out that since seeking denuclearization is no longer a realistic goal, we are left with no option but to negotiate with the North to at least freeze or cap the North's nuclear weapons program. As well-intentioned as these arguments may be, following such an advice would be a mistake. As a veteran Korea watcher, David Straub has recently put it very aptly, a negotiated freeze is like a mirage. It's an illusion that recedes very quickly as one tries to approach it. What would a freeze or cap agreement say to the rest of the world? Agreeing to a cap means U.S. accepts North Korea as a nuclear weapons state for indefinite future, which would destroy our credibility, not only with our allies, but with other rogue regimes such as Iran that are watching what we do with North Korea very closely. Secondly, one has to wonder what exactly would be frozen or capped anyway. North Korea has many undeclared facilities, and we simply do not know where they all are. This is not to say we should never return to negotiations with North Korea, but we should only return to negotiations after decisively raising the cost for the Kim Jong-un regime, and only when Kim Jong-un is genuinely interested in denuclearization. At the present moment, the Kim regime has not indicated that it is ready to reconsider its policy choices. Kim Jong-un used this year's New Year's address to again announce his plans to test an ICBM that could deliver a nuclear warhead to the continental United States. President Trump has responded with a Twitter message simply saying that won't happen or it won't happen. Kim now needs to understand that Washington is very serious about the president's statement. Words alone will not convey a strong message to the North. If there's any chance at all that the North would ever entertain the idea of giving up its nuclear weapons program, it is only because the new administration has made it very clear that the Kim regime is facing a stark choice between keeping the nuclear arsenal and regime survival. Contrary to what some believe, the US has not yet used every option available at our disposal to ratchet up pressure against the Kim regime. I agree with everything that Victor has said wholeheartedly. As a near-term solution, there's much more we can do still on the sanctions front, on the human rights front, on getting information into the North Korea, as well as on deterrence and defense and on diplomacy. In my written testimony, I go into some concrete ideas we should pursue in this effort. But here I would like to also make one point before I close my opening remarks, which is on the need to promote unification of the two Koreas as the ultimate solution. We should understand that even all these measures that we're going to talk about today, strengthening sanctions and other pressure measures, could ultimately fail. And we need to accept that in terms of bringing about change in denuclearization in the North. But all these measures are still worthwhile to pursue because they also help in the effort toward unification. Whatever North Korea's immediate future, there's no question in my mind that over the long term, its prospects are very bleak. And I look forward to discussing this point more during our Q&A session. While Kim Jong-un's hold on power seems strong for now, there are signs that there's growing elite discord among the ruling class, and Mr. Tay himself testified to this effect. All the frequent purges and executions of high-level elites in recent years may help strengthen Kim's rule in the short run by terrorizing his rivals, but fundamentally, Kim's heavy-handed rule is likely corroding long-term support, elite support for the regime. So in the final analysis, it may be that there's only one way that the threat from North Korea will come to an end, and that's when the current regime itself comes to an end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. Anthony?
Thank you. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today on this important issue. Before I summarize elements of my testimony, written testimony, I want to recognize Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel in particular for their leadership in their drafting and successful advocacy for the first comprehensive bipartisan North Korea sanctions law. The number of North Korea designations is nearly doubled over the last year, thanks largely to the law. But 88% of those persons designated were located inside of North Korea at the time of their designation. To get at North Korea's international business, we need to target additional persons outside of North Korea. In my written testimony, I review the accomplishments of the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act of 2016, outline 4 core elements to create a more effective North Korea policy, clear away myths about North Korean sanctions, and provide recommendations for Congress and the Trump administration. I will summarize my recommendations for Congress here. First, Congress could provide additional resources to the Treasury Department, Justice Department, intelligence community, and other government agencies to investigate violations of the law to allow us to stay one step ahead of North Korea. Second, restrict all tourist travel to North Korea to protect the safety of U.S. nationals. Banning tourist travel would also amplify the effectiveness of the recent designation of North Korea's flag carrier, Air Koryo, and deny Pyongyang another source of hard currency. Third, as part of the oversight function, increase transparency into investigations, ensuring that Congress is fully aware of ongoing investigations. And fourth, investigate China. It is important that Congress and the American people understand the extent of China's efforts, or lack thereof, to combat money laundering, sanctions violations, and proliferation financing. I recommend that any new legislation include specific sections on investigating North Korea's network inside China. North Korea is a difficult foreign policy challenge that the United States has failed to appropriately address. The new Trump administration presents another opportunity, perhaps our last one, to harness all the tools of American power to address this direct threat to the United States nonviolently. Today's hearing is an important step in that direction. On behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I thank you again for inviting me today and look forward to addressing your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruggiero. Ambassador Gallucci, good to see you, sir. I think that red button there may not be on.
The red button was not on. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm grateful for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you this morning on this important topic. 24 years ago, a new administration came into office and was confronted with the first foreign policy challenge, and it was a North Korea with a secret then nuclear weapons program, violation of safeguards, and announced intention to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. A year and a half later, a year and a half of negotiations later, a deal was struck with the North Koreans. Essentially, we got what we wanted out of that deal. We wanted to shut down a plutonium program that would have produced, the estimate was by the intelligence community, 150 kilograms of plutonium a year, enough for 30 nuclear weapons a year. We got that program shut down, and it was shut down for about a decade. So when the Bush administration came in, there were no nuclear weapons that we knew of in North Korea, as opposed to hundreds. They got 2 light water reactors, or got a commitment to build 2 light water reactors worth about $6 billion. They never were completed. early in the Bush administration, the North Koreans were called on their cheating on the deal. They were doing a secret deal with the Pakistanis for the other technology, which produces fissile material, uranium enrichment. So we have a case, and you can read that case lots of different ways. Will negotiations work? Will they always cheat? I think men and women of goodwill can disagree, but it is a case, and it's a non-trivial one. The Obama administration followed the Bush administration and did much the same thing. Pursued sanctions, attempted to have negotiations, never got as far as the Bush administration or the Clinton administration. I think it's fair to say that after more than a decade of negotiations and sanctions, what my colleagues have said is true. The policy has failed up until now to stop the North Korean nuclear program, and it has blossomed along with a ballistic missile program. So I think what we have now is a question of what will work. The first thing that has occurred to a lot of analysts is, let's let China do it. They're closer, they have influence, and the question is, can we rely on the Chinese to rein in the North Korean nuclear program? And I think the short answer is no, we cannot. The Chinese have overlapping interests with us, but not congruent interests. And as Victor said before, subcontracting this issue to our principal competitor in the Asia-Pacific region is not a brilliant strategy for us to follow. A second question is, and it goes to the heart of what everyone has talked about, is will sanctions do the trick? By do the trick, I mean, will they bring the regime down? Will they stop the ballistic missile and nuclear weapons program? Will they force the North Koreans to the negotiating table in the right frame of mind? And I've heard it said if we had the right sanctions, it would do all that. I don't believe it. I don't believe it yet. If I did believe it, I would be more enthusiastic about sanctions. I don't oppose sanctions. I just think if that is your strategy, it's not a winning strategy. Certainly not if you have not gotten the Chinese on board to those sanctions. I think another question for us, this administration for the United States, is for those who favor negotiations, should we settle for a freeze in the North Korean program? Even my colleagues have said the North Koreans will never give up their nuclear weapons program. So if you negotiate and that's your deal, then you want to say, let's at least go for a freeze and cap it. Okay. I believe the answer to that is also no, do not do that. A freeze is not good enough. A freeze, as one of my colleagues said, legitimizes the North Korean nuclear weapons program. It will be offensive in Seoul and in Tokyo, allies of the United States, whom we have asked to forego nuclear weapons, to then confront an adversary like North Korea, that we would permit and legitimize with nuclear weapons. So I say no, a freeze is not adequate. What I would propose is that instead of decreasing our goals, we increase our goals. And I'm an advocate, generally speaking, of negotiation. You see the ambassador line there. I come from an institution that does this for a living. And my view here is that if we insist that the outcome is no nuclear weapons, a return to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, if we insist that North Korea behave as a normal country in the international system and at least meet minimum standards with respect to how they treat their own citizens, in other words, their human rights record, we have a chance for success. And the reason is this. The North Korean nuclear weapons program is designed for really one thing, regime survival, and to deter the United States of America. The only other thing that will give the North Koreans assurance that they don't have to worry about the United States executing what they have said to me more than once is our favored policy of regime change. The only thing, apart from having their own nuclear weapons as a deterrent, is a relationship with the United States in which that is no longer our objective. And that outcome is implausible with a North Korea that treats its own people with the disrespect it does. When we look at that regime and are horrified by what it has done, by its human rights record, we are not going to get into a normal relationship. So my proposal here is that we stick to a high level in terms of what we want a non-proliferation, preventing the nuclear weapons program, but at the same time insist that the human rights record in North Korea improve so that there's a plausible outcome in which the United States and North Korea move out of a situation of an adversarial relationship. I don't think that can happen quickly or easily, but I think it's plausible. I think that the carrot for the North Koreans here might be some sort of assistance, might have to do with our military exercises with the South Koreans, but fundamentally, the thing they want is a normalized relationship with us. And we have to give them a roadmap, a path to that that meets our needs. And if we do that, over the long term, I think actually removing North Korea as a threat to the region and to continental United States is a plausible outcome. I would say that through this all, if we were to proceed in anything like that, it would have to be in close concert with our allies, particularly the South Koreans. And I would also say that we would be well off if we could avoid ourselves making the first provocation to the North in the relationship of the new administration to the DPRK. In other words, if the North Koreans test, as many of you believe they will, a ballistic missile, a nuclear weapon, I'm perfectly prepared to believe the proper response is tougher sanctions, whatever exactly that means. But I would ask that we all consider the virtue of us not being the first to strike at the North Koreans with tougher sanctions, that we look and see whether there is an outcome that might be negotiated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. I must say, in '94, I was convinced by the line of reasoning that if we did reach out to the North Koreans, we could get them to change their behavior. And so I was one of those who supported the North Korean Framework Agreement. But subsequently, I had the opportunity to talk to Wang Jung-yap, who was the Minister of Propaganda who defected through China. And he convinced me that this was a blunder. In his mind, it was an opportunity of North Korea to get on the life support system that would give them the wherewithal to continue to build support for the regime while they focused on their #1 goal. And the problem with the #1 goal of developing this nuclear weapons system is that it doesn't just stay locally. As we saw in 2007, right in the middle of the six-party talks, we suddenly stumbled over the fact, or maybe we didn't, but other intelligence services stumbled under the fact that they were building a replica of their nuclear weapons program on the banks of the Euphrates River for Syria. That facility was taken out by the IDF, but it was a reminder that as we were watching other rogue regimes, we were watching them take these flights up to Pyongyang, and we were watching the transfer of this technology and capability, ICBM and nuclear weapons capability. And so I go to an issue that I think is very important to this committee, and that was the argument we heard expressed over and over again about South Africa, that it would be absolutely implausible that sanctions passed here from this committee could have such an effect as to implode the government in South Africa and end apartheid. This was viewed as conventional wisdom, so much so that when this committee, and this is before my time, but when this committee passed that legislation, it was vetoed by the administration. Fortunately, Republicans and Democrats, I think over 80% of the House and Senate overrode that veto, as I recall history, and deployed those sanctions. The reason I tell this story is I was in South Africa with some of my colleagues here, and I had a conversation with one of the key decision makers who back at that time had been a prominent industrialist defending the apartheid system. And what he said to us is that we would not have lasted another week under the types of sanctions that the United States and Europe led and deployed against apartheid. We could not last another week without it absolutely imploding the system. And so, as a consequence of the information, at least that I got from the Minister of Propaganda, and that we're now hearing increasingly from this number 2, in the embassy in Britain, who defected from North Korea, is not unlike the same information we got from those who worked on the missile program, who told us not only was there not the money to buy any longer the clandestine gyroscopes we bought on the black market or pay for the missile program, but he couldn't pay his generals. This young man's father could not pay his generals during that year's time that Treasury Department had deployed those sanctions. And this is not a good position for dictators to be in, as relayed to us by those who had defected out of the country. So inasmuch as we have tried every other approach from my standpoint since '94, it would be wise, I would think, once to approach, again as we did once before, the Chinese financial system and ask those banks to make that choice, whether or not they're going to freeze the accounts, as they made the decision then to freeze the accounts, or whether their primary objective is to continue to do business in that way. Not a single Chinese bank was designated or fined or investigated under the legislation that we've passed. So I would ask, I think, Mr. Ruggiero, you were a professional at the Treasury Department working on these types of cases. Was this an isolated incident? And I'd just like to get your view and also Dr. Terry's view on this.
Sure. I guess I would start by saying that a Section 311 action against China is not the only option available. Obviously, there could, as you have suggested, there could be trips to China to talk to those Chinese banks and talk about the choice that you laid out, or talk to them about knowing your customer's customer. There could be fines, like we did with several European banks, billions of dollars worth of fines that we provide that were assessed against European banks. I think it's important to talk about the Justice Department and Treasury Department action in late September, where you had 4 Chinese nationals and a Chinese company that described itself as attached to North Korea in terms of trade, and those Chinese banks clearly did not provide strict scrutiny on the transactions of those individuals and that company. They set up 22 front companies outside of China to allow U.S. dollar transactions through the U.S. financial system that were on behalf of a U.S. designated North Korean bank. That was shocking, and the fact that a Chinese bank has not been punished for that at all is quite appalling.
Dr. Terry, thank you.
So your comment about not being able to pay generals really struck me. From my experience, North Korean regimes, the key pillar of stability for the North Korean regime is elite support, right? This is how the Kim regime, the family, had survived for decades. As long as you have the elite support, it's okay, no matter what happens to the public. Sanctions is one way to get at that elite support that you mentioned. This is why at the written testimony towards the end, I mentioned that the more we intensify the economic pressure against the regime, we are getting at that discontent of the elites. The less that Kim Jong-un has money, the foreign currency, to underwrite the lifestyle of the elites, we are building a potential foundation for instability. You mentioned that Mr. Tae himself had talked about how elite defection to South Korea has really increased last year, that there's a disunity among the ruling class. And the only way to get at that is to continually stir trouble at the leadership level. And as far as I'm concerned, economic sanctions it's the only leverage we really have to get at that.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. I need to go to Mr. Engel. My time's expired.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last year, former Senator Sam Nunn co-led an independent counsel on foreign relations task force that produced a report called A Sharper Choice on North Korea. Unfortunately, Senator Nunn was not able to join us today, but he did share his thoughts in the form of written testimony. So I'd ask unanimous consent to ask for Senator Nunn's testimony be entered into the record. Unanimous consent.
Without objection, I'd ask for unanimous consent. Thank you.
Thank you. Former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry has also recommended a last-ditch effort to revive sanctions with North Korea, in part to pave the way for China to become more amenable to tougher sanctions if the talks should break down. So let me ask Mr. Ruggiero, let me ask you this. How do you suggest we shape a tougher sanctions policy while not alienating China? How can Congress best preserve space for the administration diplomatically to probe North Korea? If negotiations fail, in addition to tougher sanctions, what steps should the United States and South Korea take to bolster our defense capabilities in the face of increasing aggression from the North, and how might Beijing react to these measures?
Sure. I think on the sanctions piece, as I noted in my oral testimony, the fact that it was a good step forward that we nearly doubled the number of designations, but most of those were inside North Korea, 88% inside North Korea. And as I just described, when you have a 22 entity front company scheme and none of those were designated, that seems to be the wrong approach. That would be sort of the first approach I would take, is looking at more of the companies outside North Korea. North Korea clearly uses front companies to obscure its access not only to the US financial system, but to the global financial system. When you talk to banks, as I have, they wonder, they don't want to do business with North Korea, but how do they stop the business that is clearly ongoing? And that is identifying the front companies very clearly. That's an action the Treasury Department can take. And as I noted with the chairman's question, there are many steps you can take. I understand that in a lot of ways, people want to jump right to a Section 311 action against China, which I understand will have ramifications beyond just North Korea. But there are steps you can take. I'm fairly certain that both foreign financial institutions inside China and, frankly, the big Chinese banks do not want to be doing this business with North Korea. And so making a clear and stark choice for them that if they do that business, if they do not have the systems in place to detect that business, that maybe they won't get a 311, but they'll get a hefty fine, or they themselves might, or elements of the Chinese financial system could be designated, as was done with Iran. A Chinese bank was designated. So there are different ways to do it to really show China that it's time for them to take a different approach.
Ambassador Gallucci, do you agree?
My view is that if the chairman was right about sanctions and their impact, and the South African model is a good model, then I think pursuing sanctions, maybe not initially, maybe trying for negotiations, is a plausible way to proceed, but ultimately proceeding with the most effective sanctions and avoiding the highest risk, as I understood he to be recommending, sounds perfectly plausible to me as a policy. But I remain skeptical that it will produce the results we want, that we'll see that nuclear weapons program slow down or stop, that we'll see the regime be shaken, or that we'll see the regime feel threatened sufficiently to come to a negotiating table in a new frame of mind. So I'm skeptical of that, but I honestly don't know.
Thank you. Dr. Terry, you mentioned the elites in the regime. You know, one of the things that surprised me when I went to North Korea, first of all, they didn't allow us to go out of Pyongyang, so there. And they told us we could go anywhere in Pyongyang. So we got up real early, and we took the train, and we watched people going to work. If I didn't know I was in North Korea, it would seem like any other place. The elites seemed pretty well fed. They looked good. Things were fashionable. People wore nice clothes. It could have been any big city. You know, I'm from New York, so I'm kind of used to the hustle and bustle. There are certain things that gave it away. For instance, there was a big crane building I think it was an 80 or a 90-story hotel that apparently was not done correctly and engineering-wise, and so it was just laying there, staying there. And when we came back a year and a half later, it was still there. So there were things there. There aren't many cars. A lot of the traffic lights don't even work. There are propaganda posters all over, including one that Joe Wilson, I don't know if Joe's here today, but Joe Wilson took a picture of, which showed a North Korean soldier putting a bayonet in the head of an American soldier, and it said USA on the soldier. So tell me a little bit about the elites and what we saw really wasn't reflective of what goes on there.
Kim Il-sung used to enjoy not only elite support, but elite loyalty. Even during the Kim Jong-il years, that loyalty the elites had has decreased. Now under Kim Jong-un, of course you have to support them. Look what Kim Jong-un has been doing for the last several years, right? He even publicly executed his uncle. And many elites, even last week, he just purged yet another guy. What Kim Jong-il used to do is you have the sticks and carrots approach, because elites do have vested interest in keeping the system going, because their fate is tied to the Kim regime. But what Kim Jong-un has done is, instead of the carrots and sticks, it's over-the-top purging and terrorizing the elites. So that's why Mr. Tae himself said, and with the more information, most elites are aware. Now, should they tie their fate to this regime? This is why I said the more we make it a difficult choice for the elites, I think we'll be successful. We want more elite defection. In my written testimony, when we talk about information penetration, I talk about how we should also target it towards the elites. So we need to do two things. We need to get both information into the elites, to the North Korean elites. One, that nuclear policy, this keeping the nuclear arsenal, it's not a path forward for you guys for long-term survival of themselves. Secondly, if they were to defect, there is an alternate path, a better path for their lifestyle. Perhaps that involves some amnesty, giving amnesty to these elites. But I think we need to get that information into the elites. And I think there's a definitely deterioration of the support. And elite support for the regime is absolutely fundamental in keeping that regime going.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your excellent testimonies and your leadership. A couple of questions. In a hearing that I held on June 2014, one of our key witnesses was Andrew Natsios. We all know him. A great leader, former head of USAID. And he had some very powerful insights about how we de-emphasized human rights, particularly at the six-party talks. And Dr. Terry, in your testimony today, you make, I think, a very important point. It's time now for Washington to integrate, and I would just add the word reintegrate, focus on security and a focus on human rights, normally two different policy approaches into a single unified approach. Andrew Natsios had made that very strong admonishment as well, and Dr. Cha, you make a very similar recommendation. My question, or questions, since the UN Commission of Inquiry made some very important recommendations, which still have not been acted upon, as far as I can tell. Maybe you can enlighten us on that. It is time to really ratchet up the diplomacy at the UN to make sure that happens. Especially the establishment of an ad hoc tribunal, which was recommended, or a referral to the ICC. Frankly, I think the ICC referral would likely fail, and not in a vote perhaps, but in its implementation. They have had a very unremarkable record, as we all know, 2 convictions in over 12 years, all of them in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think, there needs to be a robust court like the Sierra Leone court, or perhaps Yugoslavia or Rwanda. So a hybrid court, I think, would really send a powerful message, perhaps even to Kim himself, but certainly would begin naming names that people will be held to account. Part of the problem with the ICC is that they look at a couple of people at the top and very often get somebody in the middle, 2 convictions so far. So your thoughts on that? A hybrid court? Is it time for us to be pushing for such a court? And secondly, on the whole issue of China and the UN Commission of Inquiry properly pointed out that persons who are forcibly repatriated from China are commonly subjected to torture, arbitrary detention, summary execution, forced abortion, and other forms of sexual violence, quote, unquote. I've had several hearings of people who made their way into China, escaped, only to be sent back by the Chinese officials after being trafficked and exploited cruelly while in China for a couple of years. And then they went to prison and had horrible, some of them were executed. People spoke of those, of course, but our witnesses talked about this violation of the Refugee Convention to which China is a signatory. So your comments on both of those issues. Dr. Jha.
So first on the point of human rights and the overall policy, it has been sort of orphaned in the past, and I think since the 2014 UN COI report, there's been a change, I think, in the mindset about integrating human rights with the policy. It makes common sense in that a regime that treats its people as bad as it does cannot be expected to keep agreements or to treat other countries with any sort of respect. I think things like ad hoc tribunal, as you mentioned, an ICC referral, a UN Security Council strategy to try to fulfill some of the recommendations of the COI report are important, even if they don't succeed, because they create a drumbeat of accountability that is certainly heard within the regime. So I think that's important. And with regard to China, there have long been calls for the Chinese to allow the UNHCR access to the border to determine whether these people who cross the border qualify as refugees. The Chinese have been completely unwilling to do that, and this is another arena in which you need to continue to call China out. I think what Anthony was talking about in terms of visits with banks and bank presidents, that's something that can be done quietly and still very effective. But on this UNHCR issue, I think it has to be very loud and it has to be very public.
Thank you. And just parenthetically before going to Dr. Turi, I have asked the Secretary General of the UN, when he sat as High Commissioner for Refugees, several occasions asked him to try to implement the law, the treaty obligation. Dr. Turi.
Victor and the Bush Center actually have been doing very important work on this human rights front. So in my written testimony, I point out that focusing on North Korea's human rights is not only a right thing to do, but also it's obviously a moral thing to do, but I also think it's a source of leverage as well, because the regime is truly bothered by all our focus on the human rights issue. And Chairman Royce talked about South Africa, but I think that was the case with South Africa, apartheid era. This global isolation was a key driver, key important factor in changing the system. So we need to really continue with our efforts to isolate North Korea on this front internationally, beginning with us. And I do think what's really important is that we challenge Kim Jong-un's legitimacy, continue to challenge his legitimacy, not only for the regime's continued violations on the UN resolutions on the nuclear front, but challenge his legitimacy based on the failure of the regime to provide for the people and what he does to the people. I think that would be an important point of leverage.
No? Ambassador.
probably worth saying that 25 years ago, when we did this negotiation with North Korea, I'm not terribly comfortable saying this, but we ran away from the human rights issue. We thought rolling that into a negotiation would complicate it. It was as though when we're asking to talk about the array of artillery pieces that the North Koreans had along the DMZ. That wasn't what we were about. We were about the nuclear issue. We needed, as one of the principals said in a meeting, we've lived with North Korea for a long time, a horrendous regime, a conventional weapons threat. Why we're really involved in a crisis is because of nuclear weapons. And so the ethical, moral issue of human rights was put aside. I'm not here to say that was a mistake or whether it was wise, but that was then and this is now. And my argument here is that the nuclear issue, if you really wish North Korea to end up as a non-nuclear weapon state, that outcome is not going to be reached if you leave the state as it is. And as Dr. Terry said, as it happens, this is constructive interference. The prudential thing from a security perspective turns out to be the moral and ethical thing to do, so for both those reasons.
Thank you very much. Brad Sherman.
Thank you. Just show of hands, because I got limited time. How many of you think we should designate North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism? All four. We all pray for the overthrow of this regime, but no regime has been overthrown, to my knowledge, in maybe the last 50 years, where they had a core of fighting men who are willing to machine gun thousands of their own citizens if necessary. That's why Tehran remains in power. That's why Tunisia changed. Dr. Terry, is there any doubt that if necessary, Kim Jong-un can count on people to machine gun a few thousand of his citizens? Does he have a hard core of people with machine guns?
Yes, he does.
Thank you.
But
I got, okay. Now, the policy that's easiest for us, psychologically and politically, is to pound the table and say we'll accept nothing less than either a democratic government or a human rights supporting government, or at least one without any nuclear weapons. We've been seeking this since the 50s. We have failed. There's an analogy to South Africa, and I'm in support of all the sanctions that we can put on, but we also have to be realistic. South Africa had Nelson Mandela, and the elites knew that they faced neither expulsion nor liquidation. I don't think that Pyongyang falls quietly and softly. The other point about South Africa is every country in the world, or virtually every country, sanctioned them. In contrast, North Korea doesn't just face an absence of real sanctions from China, it gets a subsidy from China. So one can only imagine what would have happened in South Korea if the second most powerful economy in the world was dedicated to their survival and was willing to give them subsidies. It does meet our psychological needs, however, to say we demand. As a matter of fact, we wouldn't sign a non-aggression pact with them back when Cheney dreamed of aggressing. And so we can. It meets our political needs. Speaking of that, it's one we ought to have civil defense in this country. Some of us are old enough to remember when we had civil defense and we were under our desks. That met only the political and psychological needs of our country's leaders, because obviously if we faced several thousand Soviet thermonuclear weapons, the civil defense would have done us very little good. But at least the leadership of the country could say, well, we know that you face the Soviet Union, you're afraid of that, we'll give you something, you can go under your desk. Now we have a foreign policy establishment that will not admit to the American people that it may fail to prevent us from being hit by not a thermonuclear weapon, but something roughly 1/50th the size. We could prepare to minimize casualties. We won't, because that will mean that we have to admit that there's the possibility that we'd face casualties. Now, missile defense is okay politically, but remember, you can smuggle a nuclear weapon inside a bale of marijuana. I want to turn to North Korea's involvement in the Middle East. They provided the plans and the tools for the reactor on the Euphrates. Do any of our witnesses have any information as to how much money was given to North Korea in return for that very limited help? I've seen speculation in roughly the $100 million figure, but it's just the best available speculation. Now, Iran wants an indigenous program. They want to produce dozens of nuclear weapons on their own, but we all get what we need and we can't get what we want. You've testified, all of you, that North Korea needs hard currency. I know where there's over $1 billion of hard currency wrapped in cellophane. So you've got a country, now North Korea needs about 12 nuclear weapons at least to defend themselves from us. They have that. They're producing more this year. Why wouldn't North Korea sell some nuclear weapons in return for the stuff inside the cellophane? Does anybody have a reason why they wouldn't do that? Dr. Cha?
No, I mean, the historical record shows that they've sold every weapon system they've ever developed, so I wouldn't expect it would be any different with weapons of mass destruction.
I've been urging the Chinese to prohibit nonstop flights between Tehran and Pyongyang, and I think that that the United States has to make it clear that we would hold China responsible for allowing that flight. There's always a reason to stop in Beijing and get some fuel, and I'm confident that nothing goes through the Beijing airport that the Chinese don't want. One last question. We face a number of problems with China: the South China Sea, North Korea, a trade deficit. I know the easiest thing for us to do is pound the table and say we're going to get a beneficial resolution of all three of these. If we had to prioritize those three issues, what would we do? And I realize you folks are not economic, you're more national security. So how do you rate the need for Chinese cooperation with regard to North Korea with the need for China to be restrained in the South China Sea? Anybody willing to assess those two priorities, or just take the easy road of saying, damn it, we should get everything? Yes, Ambassador.
I would resist the question.
Well, of course. We should resist all questions in which we don't get everything we want, because it's politically unacceptable for us to accept less.
I think because they're interrelated, and my sense about the way diplomacy will work with Beijing will not be that we can trade things off quite that way. I
will point out that the present policy has utterly failed to get Beijing to either limit what it does in the South China Sea or to really pull the strings on Pyongyang. And if you're going to advocate that somehow we're going to get them to do everything by demanding everything, you'll need to do it on another member's time, because I'm out of time.
And thank you, Mr. Sherman, and thank each of you for being here today. Your insight has been very positive, and we're just grateful. I'm also very grateful to Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Elliot Engel for their leadership on the issue of the danger of North Korea. I believe North Korea's increasingly aggressive rhetoric and actions are of utmost concern for the security of our nation and American families. Yesterday, I introduced H-Res 92, a bipartisan initiative, along with Congressman Mike Rogers, Seth Moulton, Ted Yoho, and Brad Sherman, which condemns North Korea's development of multiple intercontinental ballistic missiles, urging the prompt deployment of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense THAAD system to protect the people of South Korea. This calls on the U.S. to apply all available economic sanctions on North Korea. I'm very grateful that, again, Chairman Ed Royce was crucial in helping develop this resolution. It's also been my opportunity, and I ran into Congressman Engel as we were departing the ranking member as he was running to another meeting. He and I had the extraordinary opportunity to serve on a delegation to Pyongyang. So we have seen what sadly to me appeared to be a Potemkin village. But we've also had the opportunity over the years, many of us, to visit South Korea. What a marvel. And when I meet veterans of the Korean War, I love to point out to them what a difference you made. In the early 1950s when you departed, Korea was an ash. Today, it's one of the wealthiest countries on earth. And as you visit Seoul, it's a forest of 40 and 50-story high condominiums with golf driving ranges and tennis clubs on top. What an achievement and the economic vitality. We also appreciate so much the alliance that we have with the Republic of Korea, and I've had sons serve in Iraq and Afghanistan, serving alongside troops from Korea, making a difference, particularly with reconstruction teams to help the people of both Iraq and Afghanistan recover. The resolution serves as an important opportunity to send a strong bipartisan message to North Korea that the House of Representatives will not stand for their ongoing illicit activities and will support our allies, especially South Korea. It is my hope that this resolution will be marked up by the committee, brought to the floor for recorded vote. It's crucial we send a clear message to not only North Korea, but our allies of the region. With that in mind, Dr. Cha, what role would the prompt deployment of the THAAD system in South Korea have as a counter to North Korean aggression?
Well, the THAAD system provides an area defense for the peninsula, which really doesn't exist right now. There's been a lot of opposition to THAAD by the Chinese, and they have been really taking unprecedented actions with regard to South Korean domestic politics and businesses to try to stop the deployment of THAAD. But there's no denying that this is a required capability on the peninsula now, in addition to the capabilities that already exist in Japan and in other parts of Asia. And there's no doubt in my mind that this administration should not just reaffirm, but should expedite the deployment of THAAD as the threat grows.
And it should be so clear, this is not a threat to the People's Republic.
This is not a threat to any other country.
It only applies to one country, DPRK.
That's right.
So thank you. And Dr. Terry, do you believe the ICBM technology would be game-changing for North Korea and the threat they pose to the United States and the region?
It would be a game-changing situation because what I'm concerned about are three things. Number one, with that, and once Kim Jong-un is confident that he has this capability, I think there's the chance for miscalculation, and then that leading to further escalation is very real. So I'm worried about dangers of miscalculation and escalation. And then what we talked about earlier, I'm very concerned about proliferation. North Korea is a serial proliferator. It has proliferated everything under the sun in the past. And in the long run, what does it really say to the East Asian region? Once North Korea becomes full nuclear capable power like that, I'm worried about potential regional arms race.
And again, thank each of you, and I'm going to hopefully be a good role model. My time is up. And so I now refer to Congressman Connolly from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Dominion of Virginia.
Thank you. It is indeed a Commonwealth, one of four. And I would say to my good friend from South Carolina, as the co-chair of the Korea Caucus, I'd be glad to be a co-sponsor of his legislation. Yeah.
You are joined.
Thank you. And welcome to our panel. Dr. Cha, it has been reported that General Kim, the head of the State Security Agency, was demoted from 4 stars to 1 star and then removed from the state agency. If the past is prologue, his fate is not a good one. He was arguably one of the most powerful people in the regime. What does this tell us about security stability in the regime? And how long can the dear leader get away with removing so many of the elites Dr. Terry talked about in such a brutal fashion? I mean, it creates insecurity, and maybe people cower. It worked for Stalin. It worked for Saddam Hussein. But it doesn't always work. It can also lead to serious instability and unrest. What's your read of this latest development and how we should interpret it?
Well, thank you for the question. So I think I would have three responses. The first, I think, is that these sorts of purges can be seen as consolidation of power, but we're 6 years into this, and they're still conducting these high-level purges, over 100 high-level purges, including not just cabinet officials, but also mid-level military officials, Army Chief of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff. There's a high turnover there.
And as Dr. Terry indicated, his own uncle, who was seen as sort of the major go-between with China.
Right, right. So I think what it really shows is there's still significant churn inside the system, that he's having problems. The second thing is that there's this dynamic, I think, happening at the elite level, and then at the general society level, North Korean society is much more, I mean, they are still a closed society, but they have much more access to foreign information than they did in the past. We at CSIS have partnered with NGOs where we've asked North Korean people, average North Korean people, how often do they consume foreign information? And they say very regularly. And they believe the foreign information more than they do the information they get from the government. So at the social level, too.
So they're not into fake news yet.
I'm sorry? No, they're not. No, they're not there yet.
Right.
There is a shift happening both at the societal level, and that's happening more slowly. And at the elite level, you have these, this internal fighting that's going on. So this is, by any metric, an unstable situation. And so just because the leader is now in his 6th year, we should not all sort of sit back and say, oh, everything's fine, he's got everything under control. I don't think that's the case, or that's clear at all.
Mr. Ruggiero, you were talking about ways we could try to leverage China to leverage Pyongyang. And there were other ways, fining and so forth, secondary sanction penalties and so forth. And I would ask you, and I'd ask Ambassador Gallucci, how does this work, though? We have a new administration in which the head of which has really already taken what, from Beijing's point of view, are very provocative statements and actions, and I'm not passing any moral judgment on them, but if you're trying to woo China's cooperation in trying to sanction Pyongyang or moderate behavior, it seems an odd way to do it. When you are castigating them for the South China Sea, you're making phone calls that historically have been avoided to avoid tension. You threaten them on currency manipulation, even though that information is several years old. You're castigating them because of unfair trade practices and the imbalance in our economic trade. How does all of that work? Doesn't that kind of run counter to the desire we have here with respect to North Korea? China's about the only country left with leverage, it would seem to me. So how does that work? Are we working at cross purposes in our own policy here with the new administration?
I guess from my perspective, I would not advocate wooing China with regard to the financial sanctions. I think that is the policy we have tried, and that is the policy that has failed.
So beating them over the head, that will work?
I think taking actions against their financial institutions, whether that is sending Treasury officials to describe the consequences of those actions, when you have Chinese nationals and a Chinese company advertising that they are working on behalf of North Korea, and those Chinese banks and other banks are still processing U.S. dollars through the U.S. financial system, that is a serious and direct threat to the United States.
Mr. Chairman, I would just ask if Mr. Ambassador Gallucci could answer, and then I yield back.
Well, we're already over. I want to make sure these guys get in. So you can ask your question. I'm going to go recognize Marino, and if he wants to answer in someone else's time, that's fine.
I would only note that we have indulged every other member except Mr. Wilson in several minutes over time, and I simply wanted the courtesy of allowing Ambassador Gallucci to answer the question already asked. But if the chairman wants to deny that courtesy, so be it. I would ask an.
Gentleman has 30 seconds.
I thank the chair, Ambassador Gallucci.
Thank you. All I would say was that, as with the previous question about China, about which would you give up and how would you prioritize, I don't understand that the best way to engage China is to say, we'll give you this if you'll give us that. That is, I think, not the way it works with the Chinese, with Beijing and with Washington. And we need to engage them on what our mutual interests are, both in their position in South China Sea and the outcome we want on the Korean Peninsula, and that's the way to go.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the courtesy, and I'm just asking unanimous consent to enter several articles from the Washington Post into the record regarding this subject.
Without objection.
I thank the
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. My first question is rhetorical. How has it been going the last 24 years with wooing? Not well, I think. I'm going to start with the ambassador, and then we can go to your right if you wish to answer my question or give me your opinion. What is the reality of overthrowing the regime in North Korea? How do we do it? Can it be done? And who takes over? Ambassador.
I don't have detailed knowledge, as in current sensitive knowledge about the vulnerability of the regime and the types of activities that we would use if we wish to overthrow a regime such as the one in the DPRK. So I can't directly answer your question. Let me admit that straight up. I think if there were an easy way to go, a safe way to go, a way that would not produce a war in the Korean Peninsula, we probably would have been exploring that for decades. I don't think there's an easy outcome in that direction. I think what we are trying to do is limit this threat, not exacerbate it.
There's no easy answer to that question, but this is why I said the same measures that we're talking about are actually an effort towards that, towards unification and potentially regime instability. The information penetration front, where we're trying to get information into North Korea, we need to start working creatively with private companies and government agencies, whatever we can do to get information into North Korea, not only the public, but the elites. And by the way, on the public too, it's not just that they should get information and watch South Korean DVDs and so on, but we need to find a way to get them to be able to mobilize, organize, because right now public does not have any kind of mechanism to do that. There's no internet, there's no social media, you can't get together to organize themselves. But the same kind of measures that we're talking about, while not satisfying, if pressed upon, I think those are the right steps even for this goal.
Doctor.
Historically, change has only come to the Korean Peninsula dramatically. It's never come gradually. And that would most likely be the case in North Korea. To me, the most likely source of instability would be the next time that the government tries to undertake some sort of widespread anti-market measure to try to suck all the personal savings and disposable income out of the system. The 2 times they've done that in the past are the 2 times we've heard the most anecdotal evidence about resistance, both at the elite and at the social level inside the regime.
What's our concern involving China from an economic standpoint, a financial standpoint? China is what now? The second largest outside holder of our debt. China has a substantial amount of money that's lent to it from the United States, not in the trillions, but in the billions. So what would happen should China decide not to hold our debt anymore and not pay our banks back the money that they owe them because we are putting some type of pressure on North Korea? Anyone?
So Congressman, the way I would respond to that would be to say that, and it goes to this question about, it's the same idea as approaching Chinese banks and saying, look, you have a choice. You can deal with the rest of the international financial system, or you can deal with North Korea. And they will make rational choices. And I think it's the same thing more broadly with regard to China policy vis-a-vis North Korea. it seems to me that if framed correctly, they will face choices. Well, they will not want to leverage the entire relationship with the United States for this one little country that may have some very small financial stake in some of their marginal financial institutions. So for me, this is a choice that China has to make, and I don't think it's a difficult one for them if it's framed correctly.
All right, thank you. I want the record to reflect that I'm yielding back 32 seconds, which no one has done here yet. Thank you.
Congresswoman Karen Bass from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been a number of comparisons made in this hearing to South Africa and the ending of apartheid and the impact that sanctions had on that. I think it's important that we remember that history correctly, because it wasn't just that we imposed sanctions, but there was an international movement that demanded the world pay attention to apartheid, and that reinforced the sanctions. And so I wanted to ask you about that. And during that international movement, too, a lot of it was led or participated by South Africans who were in exile. And so my question to you is that outside of South Korea, is there interest internationally in making the sanctions in North Korea strengthened and bringing the regime down? And wondering also for North Korean dissidents and some of the ones that have been in exile, are they doing anything like that in other countries that maybe just hasn't gotten a lot of publicity in the United States?
So I think it's a great question, and the points that you make about the comparison, I think, are very important. In the case of North Korea, I would say the closest thing that you have to the beginnings of an international movement have been over the last 3 years in terms of the human rights issue and the UN Commission of Inquiry's report on North Korea. I think this has created much more interest in the UN, among UN member states, General Assembly resolutions that passed by vast majorities condemning North Korea for human rights abuses. And so I think that's one sort of platform for building that international movement. You asked about sort of folks outside of North Korea, and of course there's the refugee community in the South, but there's also a very small community here in the United States. President Bush created the North Korean Refugee Act, which allowed for North Koreans to reside here in the United States. There are about 250 of them. Most of them just want to get an education, they want to get a job, but in the end, I think they could play a very important role in terms of the future of the country. What we don't have in the case of North Korea that you had in South Africa also was this broad non-governmental movement. I remember, divest campaigns on my college campus at that time, and so there are smaller North Korean human rights groups on college campuses, but they haven't been mobilized in the same way as we saw in the divest campaign.
The other thing too, of course, that existed in South Africa was what was going on internally in South Africa, and we've got lots of news about that. And I think that's one of the things that's the most challenging about North Korea, is that who knows what goes on. And I don't know if there's any other efforts. I mean, every now and then you hear about a journalist that goes, underground and we get some information, but I think that's the other challenge. I don't know if you know of any organized efforts.
Well, I think probably the most important efforts we've seen thus far that are organized and more systematic have been the effort to get foreign radio broadcasting into North Korea. Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, BBC now is planning to do this. That's something where the Congress has a role in terms of appropriating funds for as a part of the reauthorization of the North Korean Human Rights Act. There's opportunities there for increasing resources for getting more information into the country. The North Korean public, the North Korean people, if you give them a sliver of daylight, they will go right for it, because they're no different than the industrializing and affluent South Koreans on the other side of the border that had their opportunity. So information is a very important part of this overall equation.
Thank you. And Dr. Terry, when one of my colleagues was asking you a question about whether or not the leader of North Korea could machine gun down his population, you seemed as though you wanted to add something, and you weren't able to finish your sentence. And I just wonder if that would be connected to like the anti-market measures where there was protests in North Korea and people were shot down. But I was wondering what you were going to say.
Yes, I mean, that's true too, but what I was going to say is that actually the corruption level is very high, and because of the loyalty is now something that's more of a question. I do think, even with the security forces, you hear a lot of stories, anecdotes about how they're bribed. Yeah, everybody can bribe them, even if they catch North Koreans watching DVDs and so on, you can just bribe them. And if you to leave North Korea, often it's the way you bribe the soldiers and security guards and get out. So even at that level, you know, I mentioned elite support as one of the key pillars of stability. Another pillar of stability is the loyalty of security services and these men. And I feel that even that pillar is eroding for some time because of a high level of corruption. And if I could just answer what Victor mentioned about human rights awareness internationally, I think this is a very important point. North Korea is one of the world's worst human rights violator, and there's not enough international attention that's been paid to this. One of our colleagues, Professor Sung-Jul Lee at Tufts University, just wrote a piece of Foreign Affairs talking about how maybe it's time for President Trump to publicly call for North Korea to shut down, for example, its prison camps, where they house up to 120,000 political prisoners that's separate from regular criminal penal system. But I absolutely echo Victor's statement that there needs to be more of international awareness in terms of North Korea's human rights violations. Thank you.
Mr. Yoho, Chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you all being here. And I really appreciate my colleague, Mr. Sherman, bringing up the compare and contrast between South Africa and North Korea and how they gave up their weapon system. But what I saw there was a world community coming together, putting the sanctions on there, and the desire to get away from that because they were going broke. They couldn't tolerate that any longer. And I think we're all in agreement that that's a good thing. But I look at North Korea. We see somebody that's been rattling their saber for a long time, and they're getting closer to developing a long-range ICBM capable of carrying a miniaturized nuclear weapon, is what everybody's pretty much in agreement, possibly a hydrogen bomb that would do mass destruction anywhere it even got close to. And with China involved with the sanctions, the thing that perplexes me, I don't think anybody in the world thinks North Korea with this kind of technology is good, do they? I mean, nobody does, right? So therefore, why is China not putting more pressure, and or Iran and or Russia? Is there, I don't want to be a conspiracist, is it to do more harm to us? You know, and we're in a world economy. This would disrupt the whole world, and I would think everybody would come together. And so my question is, you know, if you can answer, kind of allude and enlighten me on that, but the question is, how do we get China and other nations to stick to the agreement? Ambassador, if you'd start.
I think the conventional wisdom on the Chinese view here is probably correct. And the conventional wisdom is that there are things about North Korea, of course, that trouble China greatly, and they are reported to be very unhappy with Kim Jong-un at various times. But at the end of the day, they do not take the role that we would like them to take in support of sanctions, and obviously even undercut those sanctions. And they do so because the very thing we're hoping to do, which is have a sanctions regime that bites in Pyongyang, is something that the Chinese worry about, namely sanctions that would bite so much that it would destabilize the regime, that the Chinese fear more than a North Korean nuclear weapons program that could be provocative to the United States and the rest of the world. What they fear more is instability, collapse. It's an economically based fear about what that would mean with refugee flows, but what it might also mean in terms of the U.S. military presence and the problems that they would confront actually literally on their borders. So what the Chinese are doing, it seems to me, is behaving as sort of a thermostat here. and making sure that at times when the North Koreans are being so provocative, they can be reined in. At other times, they're trying to make sure that the sanctions regime and other pressure on the North Koreans do not bring about the outcome we would like, which is sufficient pressure either to collapse the regime or to bring the regime to the table. I will defer to my colleagues.
Well, let me go on to this because, Dr. Terry, you brought this up, and as you all have, getting more messages in there, positive messages to the Korean people. Because what I see is if people aren't going to stick to the sanctions, if other countries aren't, we need to bring it from within and empower the North Korean people. And I would think China, with the destabilization that North Korea is doing, going down this route that it is now, would be more willing to help us bring that regime change, because I think it would be more stabilized. And, you know, your goal is to negotiate and talk about negotiations. That's what you do. But I would like to hear about your thoughts, Dr. Terry and Mr. Ruggiero, on broadcasting more positive messages in there about bringing the regime, not bringing it down, but just telling the alternative that they can go to with a freer society.
First, I would just echo Ambassador Gallucci's statement that China's long-standing policy has been no war, no instability, no nukes, and in that order. So we have, it's not that they are not concerned about denuclearization of the North. They care very much about that. It's just their priorities flipped. While we care about denuclearization first and foremost, they're worried about instability. In terms of getting information into North Korea, this is what I've been advocating. And there's, again, it's not only getting information into North Korea. I think we should also target what kind of information and target both elites and the average North Koreans, and not only also just getting information in, but being able to give some way to mobilize. Because again, I mentioned before that North Koreans have no mechanism where they can organize themselves or mobilize themselves.
I'm going to cut you off because I'm out of time, and I appreciate you all being here, and I look forward to following up with you.
Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you. Here we are.
Trooper, Lois. I've said it before. and great on these codels, too.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the panel. This has been a very confusing hearing because I'm hearing different things from sanctions, no sanctions, negotiate, unify. So I'll ask a couple questions. The first is, what, if any, implications is this, what seems to be an instability right now in the South Korean government with the corruption? I don't know whether it's corruption or not corruption, but whatever it is, I'm particularly interested if you think that has any effect on all this, and especially, I guess, Dr. Terry, you talked about unification. I was assuming you meant unification with South Korea. Is that correct?
Yes, unification and South Korean-led unification. So unified Korea would look like much larger South Korea. I think it does have a lot of implication for us because, as you mentioned, President Park is waiting right now for Constitutional Court's decision on upholding impeachment, and the new election could come sooner rather than later. And former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has dropped out of the race, and now it looks like a progressive could take over the Blue House, most definitely this year, but even sooner than December. And the one issue, it's not that I personally have an issue with a progressive government in South Korea. One concern that I have is that we might see a potential divergence in policy in terms of dealing with North Korea from Washington and Seoul. And one of the key important things, I think, in terms of dealing with North Korea is having a very tight bilateral coordination between Washington and Seoul and trilateral coordination between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. So my concern is that the new South Korean government may pursue policies that's different from what we would like.
Could you explain that?
Meaning a progressive government, a leading candidate right now, Mr. Moon Jae-in, is more is pro-inter-Korea relations, engagement, more conciliatory gesture towards South Korea, and other progressive candidates have similar views on North Korea. Some of them have even gone as far as to say they want to postpone that deployment. One or two candidates have even talked about reopening Kaesong Industrial Complex, the joint venture that North Korea and South Korea had. So these kind of policies would be something that we would not be pursuing. So this is a risk that Washington has to obviously consider. But regardless, it's extremely critical that Washington and Seoul and Tokyo have a close coordination when it comes to North Korea policy. There's no daylight when it comes to our North Korea approach. Thank you.
So I know this would be very hard to predict, but the new administration, it seems to me, our new administration, it seems to me that it would be against regime change or dealing with human rights violations unless they felt they had a direct impact on our national security. I'm guessing, I don't really know. But I would be interested if any of you have an opinion as to what, based upon what has been said, they're speculated that whether our policies would change.
If I might, what I've been trying to sell this morning is the idea that there's a consistency in the objective of addressing the human rights concerns in North Korea and getting an improved relationship with North Korea, from which one could argue they might be willing to give up a nuclear weapons program, which they see as guaranteeing their security. So if the administration accepted such a line of argument that this was a good way to go into a negotiation, then there's a way to get to our national security through a human rights approach.
Do anyone else want to make a comment?
So on your question about the situation in South Korea, I mean, this is clearly not good for the U.S.-Korea alliance relationship. I mean, I think we have Secretary Mattis went out to the region, and Secretary Tillerson spoke with the South Korean foreign minister. That's fine, and that's good for now, but those people aren't going to be in position in a few months. And it may be until the fall before the South Koreans ever have a government, progressive or conservative, in power. Meanwhile, the world is moving on, and the South Koreans are falling behind. So this is a 3-month crisis that is likely to extend for at least another 3 months, which is far less than ideal, especially if the North Koreans do something over the next 3 months.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Perry, General Perry, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Terry, I've heard that there's an idea of a nuclear freeze deal or a cap being thrown around in an attempt to deal with the growing threat of North Korea. Could you, anyway, outline what a freeze deal would look like and provide your opinion on the likelihood of any such deal stopping North Korea functionally from obtaining a nuclear device capable of striking the homeland?
Ambassador Gruch might be able to answer this since you're a negotiator yourself. I really don't believe in this so-called freeze or cap, because my personal take is that every single time deal fell apart over verification. And this is why I meant, I don't think our intelligence community even knows where all their undeclared facilities are. So what are we freezing? We're going to just take North Korean word for it? They have frozen, whatever they say, they're going to freeze. I think so it's a very difficult, this is why I called, I quoted David Straub, who called it a mirage. It's just not, it sounds good in theory, but I think it's something very hard to execute because it will fall apart over verification.
Thank you, Ambassador.
I think Dr. Terry and I end up in the same place, but by a different route. I agree with her that it wouldn't be wise to have as a goal a freeze on North Korean nuclear weapons activity, because I think it would be provocative to our allies to legitimize and accept the North Korean nuclear weapons program where it is, rather than try to roll it back. Secondly,
so yours is a difference of opinion from the doctors. Hers is on verification.
No, I actually agree with that because we are also accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, which would obviously alienate our allies. And so, but I agree with that. It's just that there's another angle of how do we verify.
So I don't I don't disagree that there's a verification issue, because there are facilities whose location and existence we are uncertain of. So that is plausibly there too. But I want to say that if we were looking at what we do now with North Korea, saying that as a first step, we'd like no more testing of nuclear weapons, no more testing of ballistic missiles, a freeze on plutonium production at the reactor we are aware of, and the one centrifuge facility that we could monitor we'd like not to operate, and we call that a freeze. But no, there may be other facilities. That's not bad. It's just not an end game. It's a step.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ruggiero, can you talk about the collaboration between North Korea, Iran, China on not only things nuclear, but ballistic missiles and weaponry or accoutrements, if I will, of that sort?
Sure. Iran and North Korea have a long-standing ballistic missile relationship, and it has been for over a decade at least. The Treasury Department last week acted against Chinese nationals inside China working with the Iranian missile program. I've detailed both in my written testimony about there are Chinese nationals and Chinese companies that are assisting North Korea, both in the processing of US dollar transactions, but then also of acquiring parts for their ballistic missile program. I also wanted to point out that when I talk about how we should approach China with regard to their financial system, that we should take maybe a page from the Iran playbook, where about 10 years ago, we found that financial institutions were more interested in some of the restrictions that we wanted to put in place, the sort of choice that the chairman asked about it's either us or them. And I fully expect that the Chinese government will not be on board with that, but I think that Chinese and foreign financial institutions inside China are happy to make that choice, and they will not choose North Korea.
And do you think that will be potentially effective in curbing the sale or the transfer of the technology, the implements, et cetera? And isn't it also, it's illegal for, if this stuff is confiscated over the ocean or at the port, it would be deemed as illegal at that point as well, wouldn't it?
Sure. I think in the sort of seize and dispose, the interdiction provisions that I think you're referencing in the resolutions, I would call for the United States and our close allies to have a robust definition of what those UN Security Council resolutions look like and should be. I mean, it's hard to predict in the North Korea space as other spaces, but I guess my point on the statistics is that if we had a doubling of sanctions, which we did over the last year, it suggests to me, and that most of those, 88% of those, are inside of North Korea, perhaps we're doing it the wrong way. And if we started, as I said, with the myths in my written testimony, if we started to do it the right way, in a sustained way, then maybe we would get to the change in the calculus for North Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
We go to Mr. Ted Lieu, Colonel Ted Lieu of California.
And thank you to the panel for being here. Last year, I had the opportunity to go to South Korea on a bipartisan delegation with Chairman Royce and others, where we received threats assessments on North Korea. We visited DMZ and met with our warfighters. And one of the issues that struck me is the continuing advances in ballistic missile technology by North Korea. And I do believe sooner rather than later, they will develop an ICBM that can strike Alaska or Hawaii or California. And as you know, the THAAD missile system hits missiles on their way down. So a THAAD missile system in South Korea wouldn't actually do anything to protect the U.S. homeland from such a launch. What is your view on airborne lasers? So we used to, as you know, have an airborne laser program. It was quite expensive at the time, but it did meet its requirements. It was scrapped because it was too expensive. And Secretary Gates, when he said why he didn't want it, is you had to get, for example, in Iran, within its own airspace to shoot down these sites. North Korea is geographically quite different. It is much smaller. You could, in fact, have airborne assets that could get quite close. And with new advancements in laser technology, is this something we should be investing more in? And I want to get your thoughts. Anyone can answer.
I'm going to take the question, sir, as an opportunity to say that we ought to be careful about what we're advocating when we advocate for THAAD. I think we ought to advocate for THAAD, but we ought to understand the limits of that system within the layered defense that we are deploying in Northeast Asia. That if you take THAAD and the Aegis system and the terminal phase Patriot 3, we have systems there that really are not going to protect us against the kind of missile, or not with any kind of confidence anyway, that we're talking about and that most people are concerned about right now, namely a missile of ICBM range and reentry vehicles velocities. The geography, the orientation of the launch, none of this makes much sense. You raised particularly the airborne laser, and I think the appeal of that, people who think about ballistic missile defense, is that that's a launch phase intercept. And if you had a launch phase intercept, one doesn't worry about decoys, doesn't worry about numbers of missiles to deal with in a radar at one particular time. It has many advantages. My appreciation of that issue is that there are enormous numbers of technical challenges of keeping a laser on target, of being, as you say, geographically proximate to the launch, and these are not trivial. I have really no idea whether we have looked hard at the application for North Korea, but I wouldn't see it as a near-term solution in any event.
Well, the reason I ask is they don't either have a near-term ICBM that can strike the U.S. homeland, but it seems like we ought to invest in defenses that potentially could stop one of those launches, because it's not clear to me that there's any other way to stop their advancements in ICBM technology.
I think if we put our energy into ballistic missile defense to deal with the North Korea case, the North Korea case will advance much more quickly. The offense-defense competition much favors North Korea over us. And this is not an argument against ballistic missile defense. I think our continuing efforts here are worthwhile, but I think we need to think this through without depending upon an ability to shoot down a North Korean ICBM.
Right. Thank you. Anybody else have any other thoughts on that, or do you agree with that testimony?
I think Ambassador Gallucci's response really covered what I wanted to say. The only thing I would add is that this is where the previous discussion about a freeze and a cap become important, because that would at least become a platform from which you could start to retard the growth of the program. So I don't have any problem with a freeze or a cap. The problem that I have is paying for it, because in the past two agreements we paid for it, and we paid nearly $500 million if you put the two agreements together to freeze their program, which they eventually broke. And for some reason, I just don't think this White House is going to be willing to pay for a freeze.
Thank you. Let me just give you one more concluding thought. I agree that there's technological challenges. I think there is also some usefulness if there's a threat that the U.S. could do this. If there's a system that might work, that even gives us more leverage than we do now, which is we don't really have a system. And with that, thank you for being here.
It was leverage we used with the former Soviet regime, that tactic, that strategy. Congressman Liu. We go to Ambassador Wagner.
I thank the chairman very much, and I thank you all for being here with us today. While the effects of the 2016 sanctions cannot yet be fully determined, it is clear that to date, global sanctions efforts, in combination with the Obama administration's policy of strategic patience, failed to disrupt growth of the North Korean economy or to advance denuclearization. Jim Walsh and John Park's research convincingly argues that North Korea, Inc. has successfully innovated around sanctions. Clearly, there is much work to be done on gathering intelligence about North Korea, Inc., engaging China, encouraging corporate compliance with sanctions, and seriously considering, I believe, secondary sanctions. But for North Korea to give up its nuclear program, the regime must feel that denuclearized, I should say, North Korea with good U.S. relations would be superior to a nuclearized North Korea with bad U.S. relations. Given new political realities in South Korea and the United States, and Prime Minister Abe's longtime interest in the abduction issue, we should also seriously consider, I think, trilateral diplomatic efforts. And Ambassador Gallucci, could you please discuss the strategic validity of reestablishing official in-country engagement, either through engagement on retrieving POW MIA remains, or through projects on agriculture, public health, education, or even weather forecast technology?
Thank you much for the question. I think those sorts of things that increase the contact, and one sums it up and says the engagement with Pyongyang, are generally thought to be a good idea if they're going someplace. And if we didn't have an overwhelming security threat from North Korea, we could say, well, we need an improvement in relations. This will improve relations. But as we move along, this is not fine wine. It doesn't get better with the passage of time. The threat increases, the threat of transfer, the threat of war, the threat of a ballistic missile capability that reaches us. So that what you've mentioned are the kinds of things which fit in terms of an overall strategy if we had one. In other words, if we were engaged with the North and we were trying to persuade them exactly as you said it, that they would be better off not being an adversarial relationship with us. They wouldn't have to worry about us launching an effort at regime change. They could count on us. Then, okay, I think this all makes sense.
Dr. Cha, you wrote briefly about engaging with North Korea on nuclear safety. I believe with the right sequencing, there could eventually be room for multilateral exchange here. Would nuclear safety talks be prohibited by current UN sanctions?
I don't have the specific answer to that, but I think they might be. Yes.
Well, under that circumstance, would you recommend dismantling those prohibitions to establish nuclear safety talks with North Korea?
Well, I think there's another way to approach it, Congresswoman, which is to do it at the Track 2 level, experts talks, which could be useful. I mean, this is a program that is growing quickly and has not had any sort of international inspection for over a decade. If they run the nuclear program like they run the rest of the country, they do cut corners on things. And so at the expert level, I think that might be one way to address the issue.
In my limited time, Mr. Ruggiero, could you quickly discuss economic ties between North Korea and our Southeast Asian partners like Vietnam and Thailand? How can the UN and U.S. better track trade numbers, and should the U.S. be applying more pressure to these countries?
Sure, I'm happy to address that. I would also mention that in the training and technical provisions of the UNSCRs, there's an ability for the committee to approve certain. So if there is a restriction with the UN resolutions, so I don't think you have to get rid of them completely. But I would raise the point on the UN panel of experts has talked about the lack of implementation reports with regard to their UN resolutions, and I think Southeast Asia is one area. There are other areas. There are some, I believe it's 90 countries that have never reported on their implementation with regard to the resolution, North Korea-related resolutions. So that's an area really where the United States can lead and get those countries.
And we need to. I think the numbers are going to be astounding, and a better tracking of these trade numbers, et cetera, is important. We've got to apply more pressure to make sure that that happens. I believe I'm over my time. I thank the chairman for his indulgence, and I thank you all very, very much.
I thank the gentlelady. I think this concludes our committee hearing. I would make the observation that we really appreciate the battery of witnesses that have come before us today, and probably will continue to be engaged with all of you as we try to wrestle with this. And given the nature of this threat described today, it's not that surprising that in the meeting between President Obama and President Trump. And President Obama conveyed the thought that the number one threat to the United States was going to be North Korea. And I think, fortunately, this committee has provided the administration some powerful authorities to deploy in this circumstance, and I think our witnesses argued very powerfully that there's a number of things that can be done on this front that would be helpful, and we look forward to continuing to work with you as we move forward. Thank you again. We are adjourned.